is not the case that the main problem with morality is that we can't agree what's right. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been studying for some years is the extent to which certain moral principles are shared across human groups. In fact, we recently, a few years ago, ran a study in which we analyzed huge amounts of ethnographic writing, more than 600,000 words of it, selected from 60 cultural groups from around the world, and found an incredibly high degree of agreement about what is morally good. In fact, there are 7 rules that people everywhere regard as morally good, and they are all about various forms of cooperation. Disagreement about what's moral isn't really the main problem when it comes to getting people to act pro-socially. The main problem is the one I've described. It's not the only problem, but one of the main problems, let's put it like that, is this is motivating people to do things that selfishly they wouldn't want to do, and trusting that others will do so. So fusion, why is fusion, identity fusion, relevant to this problem? Well, the reason it's relevant is because identity fusion involves a special kind of form of group alignment in which your personal identity and your group identity become effectively fused together. The boundary between them becomes porous, such that if you make a person's personal identity salient, their group identity automatically becomes accessible, and vice versa. You make their group identity salient and it taps into personal agency. This is very different from identification, something that social identity theorists have been studying for many years, where there's a sort of hydraulic relationship between your personal and group identities, so that making one salient makes the other less accessible. Okay, so identity fusion is different because it allows our sense of group identity to be motivated by personal agency, and this is why it's such an important instrument potentially for getting people to sacrifice self for group. When somebody is fused with a group and their group comes under attack, for those people it feels really personal. Now, a lot of the literature on fusion has focused heavily on the effects that this form of very intense group alignment has on willingness to fight and die for a group. And it's certainly true that fusion levels tend to be extremely high in military groups, in various kinds of revolutionary groups, civil war, armed groups of all kinds. There's a lot of evidence that fusion plays an important role in motivating the willingness of soldiers to sacrifice themselves for their fellow fighters. But it's also the case that fusion can motivate various peaceful forms of pro-social action. And we have a lot of studies now showing that forms of charitable giving, willingness to act on sort of conservation issues and environmental problems, and a whole diversity of things that don't involve fighting and dying at all, but which do involve various forms of self-sacrifice and trust that others will also make the effort, that those things are often motivated by feelings of fusion. Now, the pathway to fusion is not particularly obvious. It's taken us quite a while to unpick this pathway, but there seem to be 2 dimensions to it. One of the things that gets people fused with a group or cause is sharing intensely personally transformative and self-defining experiences with other members of the group. Recall that what is special about fusion is that your personal identity and your group identity become fused together. And one way of making that happen is to have things that are essential to your sense of who you are as a unique person shared with other group members. Another pathway to fusion involves the perception of shared biology, and this lies at the heart of feelings of kinship, what's sometimes called psychological kinship, and familial ties. Now, both of these dimensions that give rise to fusion are present in various kinds of cultural groups. There are rituals that seem to be perfectly designed through cultural selection and winnowing processes that have given rise to these things, perfectly designed really to elicit very strong feelings of shared experience and in some cases of shared biology, so as to generate feelings of fusion. And I got one of your colleagues, John, very kindly to circulate a copy of my soon to appear book called The Ritual Animal, which describes, among other things, how rituals across a diversity of cultures around the world and throughout human history have been used to generate this kind of very strong form of group alignment. As I mentioned earlier, since we're talking about shared experiences that are very intense and help to shape the personal self, as well as the shared experiences of a group, as you'd expect, these sorts of pathways to fusion are often found in military groups as well. In fact, it turns out that bad experiences are often much more powerfully motivating for feelings of transformed personal identity, and when shared with others, provide a particularly salient pathway to fusion. And so it's not surprising that soldiers experience very high degrees of identity fusion, very strong forms of social solidarity and cohesion. But we've also found this pattern in lots of other groups that suffer intense experiences together. Embattled groups of various kinds who suffer persecution based on things like race or religion, groups that suffer from all kinds of things, including natural disasters. And this is going to be a theme of Mike's talk shortly. Even mothers who go through traumatic births and feel that that traumatic experience is shared with others can be fused together through those experiences. So we have learned a lot about the pathways to fusion. And the big question, it seems, going back to Peter Singer, is how could we mobilize these sorts of pathways to fusion to get people to act on major challenges, global challenges, for instance, like extreme poverty? I'm just going to give a couple of examples of ways, some of the examples discussed actually in my book, The Ritual Animal. But I'm going to encourage and invite all of you to put forward examples that you've come across through your professional experience, because as I'll explain shortly, I think there's a serious shortage of examples of problems that could be solved with sufficient intensities and amounts of social cohesion. So two examples that I'd like to just consider very briefly. One is how we could potentially harness religion to address the problem of global heating and climate change. We know that all the major religions of the world and their various offshoots provide strong scriptural support for stewardship of the planet, taking care of the environment. We know that religious groups, based on both of the pathways to fusion that I've talked about, generate very intense forms of social cohesion through their rituals and through various aspects of their beliefs and practices. But very rarely do we see efforts to harness that kind of social cohesion to address the problem of climate change. We do see sporadic examples of it, and they are important. For example, I think a couple of years ago, Sikhs put together a challenge to plant 1 million trees around the world to celebrate the 500th anniversary since the founding of Sikhism. But there are numerous other ways in which not just Sikhs, but members of all kinds of religious groups could add to their sort of ritual calendars efforts to address environmental issues. Other ways in which cohesion could be effectively harnessed include, for example, the very intense cohesion we find in football fans. This is a topic that interests me greatly because it's clear that from a lot of studies that we've done in Brazil, in Australia, in the UK, in Indonesia, for example, that football fans are exceptionally highly cohesive groups. And of course, high levels of fusion among football fans very often lead to unwanted outcomes in terms of hooliganism and intergroup fighting. But there is also great potential to harness the fusion of football fans in more positive ways. And an example of a project that has been inspired by that idea is known as the Twinning Project, the brainchild of former Vice President of the Football Association and of Arsenal Football Club, David Dean, which has set out to pair or twin together the football clubs throughout the UK with their local prisons, and to set up programs that enable inmates in those prisons to learn not just football skills on the pitch, but many of the crucially important values that participation in team sports can provide, and that will help make them less vulnerable to recidivism post-release. And one of the things that my research group is currently doing is developing longitudinal studies to look at the effects of this twinning project on rates of recidivism subsequently. Is it the case, for example, that undergoing the intense shared experience of participation in the twinning project bonds them together, not only to each other, but to the kinds of values that one associates with the football community, which include law-abiding values shared by the wider society at large, an emphasis on healthy living, on not using drugs, and so on. And also, is it possible to harness the cohesion of football fans themselves so as to provide more hospitable communities to those returning to society after spells in prison? So is reintegration facilitated through efforts to harness the cohesion of football fans? These are big questions that are worthy of much further consideration, I think. I'm really interested in the idea that there are lots and lots of collective action problems that could be solved very effectively by harnessing social glue, not necessarily in the domain in which we are immediately confronted with, but in surprising areas that we wouldn't normally associate with that problem. For instance, nobody automatically associated football fandom with reducing rates of recidivism among ex-prisoners and reducing the numbers of people in British jails. That was a brilliant piece of creative thinking on the part of David Dean and his colleagues. But I think it's not unique. I think there are lots of ways in which we could do something similar. And I think many of us in our professional lives notice ways in which highly cohesive groups could be harnessed to address problems that we all agree need to be addressed. One sort of idea that has occurred to me and that I would love to have your feedback and thoughts on is the possibility of actually building a list, even a database of such examples. Some of them could be examples of ways in which this is already being done, so that we can learn from those examples. And some of it could be ways in which it could be done or should be done, and you know, how it might be done. So maybe we should think about setting up some kind of website, perhaps as part of CRIC. Why not call it socialsolutions.org or something similar, where we amass examples of this kind. It could become a treasure trove for researchers interested in the effects of social cohesion on pro-social action of various kinds. And it could help us to address the often rather easily dismissed or evaded question of how we make what's morally right into something that people actually act upon. Now, I think the idea in this session is for eventually, well, after we've heard from Mike, who's going to talk, I hope, about some of the ways in which shared experience has been used as a basis for solving interracial problems in Louisiana, particularly in the wake of the shared experience of the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina. But after that, John will be chairing a session in which he will invite Q&A. That's great. But it would be also great if people wanted to contribute examples and to discuss whether something along the lines that I've been describing, some kind of database that amasses examples of the ways that social cohesion can be used to provide solutions, is worth pursuing as an idea. So, Mike, if you're happy to go ahead with your talk next, I think then we hand over to John for a more general discussion.
The most divided social time in American cities, racially divided, is Sunday morning. The most unified social time in the fall in this American city and lots of others is when you gather in the Superdome to watch the Saints play. The racial, I've been through this many times, and all I can say is that the racial mood of a place that has 70,000 people in it is quite different to what we're used to interracially all the rest of the week. And it's not that all the rest of the week is awful. It's just that there's something very special going on there. And it's not just in the Dome. If you went around the city and you could see people gathering for game watching parties and so forth, black and white, most of them would be wearing the various versions of the uniform, the colors of the Saints. So there's quite a contrast there. The way people gather religiously on Sunday mornings, Christians particularly, is our most divided moment. And the way we gather to watch our football team is our most unified moment. And I think that maybe bears some reflection in terms of what Harvey was saying. When I've talked to people, as I often do, about CRIC, I talk about it as a network, a social network. And it's a social network that obviously in various ways connects back to our friend and colleague, John Alderdice, reflects the quality of his relationships with so many people over so many years, including ourselves. And so I wanted to just share some wonderful news with you. I might just stop talking after this actually and see where we go. But our colleague Nadina Christopoulou is one of the founders and the director of something called the Melissa Network of Immigrant Women in Greece. And she was going to take part with Harvey and me this morning and talk about the Melissa Network as an example of social glue within a particular population, that is immigrant women living in Greece. About a month ago, Nadina and some of her colleagues began totally off of their own social platform, an effort to get women out of Afghanistan. And she's been living this now for 4 or 6 weeks. And I just got this text from her this morning. Please apologize to Harvey on my behalf. I didn't wish to cause any inconvenience, and I wanted to ask if I could attend, but I just got a message that our first 7 female MPs are arriving today, so I won't be able to, but we are so thrilled. She went on to say that it's a group of 50 in total, 7 female MPs and their families, and we are frantically preparing for their arrival in direct and ongoing consultation with them and their colleagues over WhatsApp. And then her last comment was all-night calls between Afghanistan, Iran, Tbilisi, Georgia, California, Tajikistan, Athens, and Berlin. So that's one of our colleagues that most of us haven't met yet. And when Nadine and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the thing that struck me about it, and we spoke about it a little bit, is that the Melissa Network is what I would call a social action network. That's where people not only communicate, but they also take decisions and carry them out together. There is obviously a powerful network of a very strong network that has grown up in Afghanistan over the last 20 years of women leaders in civil society, and now that network has been shattered. But it isn't shattered into individuals. Evidently, it's shattered into fragments, and some of those a fragment of that civil society network will be there at the Athens airport this evening or this afternoon about 9:30, and they'll be met by the social network of Melissa, and something new will grow out of that. So, John, if it's okay, I'd like to come back to you, and Harvey, come back to you and reschedule that presentation for another time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about social action networks as an example of generating what Harvey has called social glue. Obviously, this kind of social glue is not at the level of intensity, maybe we could call it the super glue, of the kinds of relationships that make people prepared to die for their group. Nonetheless, it's real social cohesion, it's real social connectedness, and it's across racial lines. So I like to do two things. I kind of like to do this quickly in two parts. I'm going to show you very quickly a set of network diagrams, and they're in pairs. This is a group of about 50 leaders in the metropolitan New Orleans area. And this was the state of their connectedness with each other at the time the hurricane hit the city in August of 2005. I'm not, just in case it's not clear, government, business, religious, nonprofit, higher education, and philanthropy. These are leaders from those different sectors, and this is what their connections look like at the time that the hurricane came, and this is what those connections look like 2 years after the hurricane. The density of that network is about 3 times greater than the first one. All right, so that's the overall picture, and then I want to just quickly break it up into a couple of subsets or subparts. The first one here shows the government. These are the government actors who were in that larger diagram, and the degree of their relatedness before the storm, and the next one shows their relatedness after the storm. Then in the next one, we see the connectedness of business leaders before the storm and after the storm. Okay, and then in the civic subgroup, civil society subgroup, this is what their connections look like. I should say our connections, because that's where I would fall in this diagram. And then in the next slide, we see what those looks like after 2 years. So if you put all those subgroups back together, you get overall pictures that we had at the beginning. Now, I want to. So that's a picture of the relationships. But one subset of that larger picture is something called the New Orleans Crime Coalition that we organized after the hurricane, because our criminal justice system was already in terrible shape, and every single part of it was devastated further by the hurricane. And so, the terrible thing was that we had a really hard time getting the local justice system up and going again. The good news was that the local criminal justice system was in such terrible shape that we had a chance to do a rebuild. And that network that I just showed the pictures of before played a really important role in that rebuild. One of the things that we did, our crime coalition did, was begin to conduct a annual survey of citizen perceptions of the police department. And you have the years there between 2009 and our most recent survey just a few months ago, 2021. Notice that when we began, the overall satisfaction level was 33%. As it stands today, it's 52%. And it has been, as you can see, for instance, in 2016, it has been higher than that. So it moves up and down, and it moves up and down with events. For example, notice the relatively high, very high score really in 2011, 60% approval. Next year, that's at 47% approval. What happened was there was a very public trial of 10 police officers who had killed people on a bridge who were trying to get out of New Orleans. It was called the Danziger Bridge, and it brought tremendous shame on the police department and the city. And as we were, just before our poll went into the field, the verdicts in those cases were announced, and you could literally see what happened to citizen evaluations of the police department at that point. Okay, so if we could just go to the next one, please. I want to bring the question of race into this. I want to say 10 years ago, we first began to ask the question about differences in Black and white perceptions of the police department. And to my surprise, there has been very little such difference. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of that. So this slide asks, overall, would you say that you are very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, neither satisfied, et cetera, with the New Orleans Police Department? And all respondents, that's the blue bar on the left, 52%. Blacks, 51%. Whites, 52%. And that's been a typical finding over these past 10 years. We have not found differences much at all between Blacks and whites in perception of the police department, which might be surprising to you. If you take a look over on the right-hand side, and this is something that appeared for the first time in this year's survey, the big gap that we had was not about race, it was on age. Those respondents who were 18 to 44, 37% said that they were satisfied overall with the police department. And those 45 or older, 58% said that they were overall satisfied with the police department. We could come back and talk about that if you'd like to. These are places where you can see some difference, and then again, not very much difference. But if you look at appropriate force, in 2021, the African-American response was just over 30%. That is, they felt that force was appropriate, whereas the corresponding white perception was 42%. And then we look in a similar way at honesty and integrity, ethics and professionalism. And again, you can see that mostly there are not real differences there. And it does make sense, surely, that there would be some differences around appropriate force, given what's been happening in the country for the last couple of years. Okay. 14% of the respondents thought it had increased, and 29% thought it had decreased. That's of all respondents. Among Black respondents, 18% thought it had increased, and 26% that it had decreased. Whites, 9% and 32%, and so forth. So we are not seeing, and I don't think New Orleans is typical on this right now, and I could say why later if you like, but we're not seeing polarization around police brutality and misconduct compared to a few years in our ongoing survey of citizen perceptions. This is a question that we asked about how people feel, whether people feel the city is safe or not. The blue bar on the left, 35% say yes. Blacks, 36% say yes. Whites, 33%. And again, we have our 1844, 45-year plus. So the perception of the city as safe or not safe, not a big difference in racial perceptions on that. And this is the same, well, it's a similar question. People talking about whether their own neighborhood is safe. There are some differences. There. Final slide, maybe just, yeah, there we go. So this is the question. This is from a Gallup poll earlier this year. Do you think that relations between Black and white people will always be a problem for the United States, or that a solution will eventually be worked out? And the response by African Americans is the green line, and the response by whites is the blue line. And you can see how that kind of tracks over time and has taken a sharp drop in the past 18 months or so, for reasons that we're all probably aware of, the killing of George Floyd and others by the police department. So my point in this is just to say that while there's a lot of polarized talk in the country, in the US about race relations, I believe that it's important, but it's on the surface of something much deeper, and that something much deeper is the interracial organizing and relationship building that has been going on since the civil rights movement in the United States. I don't think the people that I know who are committed, know directly or indirectly, who are committed and who are part of that history, honestly, they don't have a lot of time for the so-called anti-racism debate. And there are two reasons for that. One is that they don't see it going anywhere. They don't see a plan. They don't see concrete notions for change coming out of it. And secondly, they're busy with this other kind of social networking, which I've described here. And this kind of interracial work is going on all over the United States. It's often referred to as community organizing, but social action networking is a perfectly good thing to call it, I think. And I think that it is building day to day, issue to issue, place to place, the kind of social glue that Harvey has talked about, not the glue of people who are in combat together, but the people who are working together at social change in the public arena, in the places where they live. And I'll stop with that, John.
I guess if I try to put together what the two of you have been saying, and please correct me if this is not correct, but that one element of the development of social glue or fusion is the shared difficult experience more than the shared pleasant experience, if I put it in that way. So I suppose one of the questions that emerges from that is whether, given the trauma that is being experienced globally, not in precisely the same way everywhere, but nevertheless, the trauma of the pandemic and all that is associated with that, there's a great deal of discussion and speculation about whether that will enable us to come together more as a global community, if such a thing exists, or whether it doesn't at all, whether it has an entirely negative effect or very little effect at all, or whatever. So I suppose one question I'd like to just ask you before we proceed further is whether it is your sense that that particular traumatic experience, whether there's any evidence that it is helping to bring the community of the world together, whether it's too early to say, or whether there are ways that we should be trying to measure that question or measure that potential outcome, and whether either of you have thoughts about that, because that's obviously the particular trauma that all of us are experiencing.
If I might jump in on, so Mike, if you want to go ahead.
No, please go right ahead, Harvey.
I think, John, you really put your finger on the nail, sorry, your finger on the button. I think you're quite right, basically. I think that, but it's important to emphasize that shared experience, although, and particularly shared dysphoric or negative experiences, although they are strongly linked to identity fusion, they are not an objective thing that we can point to as something that, sort of unmediated by human psychology. Our perception of sharedness is absolutely crucial to the fusion process. And I think one of the things that I just like to say in admiration, really, of both Mike and Nadina is that both of them have an extraordinary capacity to notice where those kinds of important shared experiences lie. In Nadina's case, I visited her in Athens, and she has the most extraordinary network there, the Melissa Network, which is able to show people to demonstrate to them the incredibly powerful basis on which their life experiences have been shared, even though they come from very diverse parts of the world. And even more extraordinarily, she's managed to persuade people in Athens, in the host community, who were originally very opposed to sort of any ingress of foreigners and immigrants, to contribute to the work of the Melissa Network based on a recognition of shared experience. I think that's an extraordinary accomplishment, but it shows how reframing experiences can make a difference. And in Mike's case, I think the networks it tells a very powerful story, the slides that he showed, but I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the substance of the relationship between going through a hurricane together and tackling divisions on racial grounds is non-obvious. It's not something that is automatically apparent, right? But that is, in fact, what's happened. And it's happened in part because of a phenomenon that Mike himself has coined a term for. He calls it barrier crossing leadership. And together with Mike, we've actually done some empirical research into what it is that motivates barrier crossing leaders. And it turns out that it's a recognition of shared experience, which makes them different from barrier-bound leaders who are only interested in their own groups. So shared experience, John, is really important, but it's not something that we can take for granted. It has to be shaped and it has to be discovered. And it's people like Mike and Nadina who discover it. But we're all capable of discovering it. And I think the same applies to COVID and the shared experience of the pandemic. It's only shared to the extent that we recognize that sharedness. It's also divided people in lots of ways, as we know. But if we focus wisely on the shared aspects in pursuit of forms of cooperation that we can all sign up to, then we have the potential to utilize that shared experience in a positive way.
Thanks, Harvey. Mike, did you want to say something?
Yeah, John. Yeah, thank you. I would like to, and I want to try to ratchet this down as close as we can to the local level. So let's say to a city. What in my experience, what causes these social networks that are diverse and capable of acting together to come together and act is that there have to be some common neuralgic points. There has to be some shared pain. There has to be some shared anxiety. There has to be something that people are worried about, that kind of worried about together, that provides a motivation for them to gather and begin to figure out who they are and what they could do about it. That's one thing. For instance, right now, you may have seen that another hurricane paid us a visit about 2 weeks ago, and the entire city lost electrical power for several days. When that happens in August in a place like New Orleans, you get some very predictable, mundane, and very unpleasant outcomes like trash at the curb that cannot be picked up. So I sat and listened to a whole city council meeting last week of people, black and white, mostly working class people, I would say, pleading and screaming and crying and confronting political leaders about how can you let this go on outside my door? Rats, odor, mold, horrible stuff. That's a great example of a basis for coming together and making a social network, an action network to respond. What makes something like that interracial, in my experience, is not that someone is saying, let's have an interracial activity. No, it's saying, let's get rid of the garbage, and we can do that better if we do it as blacks and whites going in to deal with the city council and the mayor and things like that. So pragmatically, it's pain channeled into a certain set of relationships that can lead to various kinds of action. But just to quickly get out of the sort of dysphoric world for a second, when having thought about this, worked at it and thought about it for 25 years now, I've asked myself, why do you do this? Why do people do this? Why do these colleagues and friends of yours, why do these people in another city that you found out about, why do they do it? And the answer is, it's never for money. It's never for fame. I mean, a little bit of local fame might come, but not nearly enough, I promise you, to cover the cost of this. What it is, and I think this relates very much to the 2 points you were making, Harvey, it's seeing the opportunity to make something happen in a collective that you cannot make happen yourself, like getting rid of the garbage. And the other thing is, it's the respect and the trust of the people that you work with. To me, if you took out those two things, you'd get the motivation for doing this kind of work.
Thank you very much indeed.